And at number 10 is Super Mario Bros. Let's start off this list with addressing that nostalgia I just mentioned. A campy classic in the form of Super Mario Bros. It's got all the cheesy things that a video game movie adaptation requires, like real-life sort of explanations as to why the characters you love are now roaming around in the three-dimensional reality we call home. Yoshi is an actual dinosaur, and Mario and Luigi straight up go on an adventure in the sewers. And then there's Bowser. Holy hell, Bowser. Up next, number 9 is Need for Speed. Based off the Need for Speed series by EA Games, not to be confused with the 2003 one that was based off of a comic, stars Aaron Paul and Dominic Cooper. Aaron Paul is a street racer named Toby Marshall who embarks on a cross-country race to avenge his friend's death. As is the trend you'll soon spot with many of the films on this list, Need for Speed wasn't really critically acclaimed, with one critic even going as far to call it a glorified commercial for the 2015 Ford Mustang. Ouch. Up next, number 8 is Tron Legacy. While some people think this film wasn't all too great, you can't deny it didn't have some pretty impressive special effects. And that soundtrack, come on, so good. And we're talking the 2010 Tron here, which is actually a sequel to the 1982 Tron. So if you're wondering why Tron is on this list, it's because it actually is heavily inspired by Pong, the early arcade video game. And after the 1982 film came out, a whole franchise was spawned, also leading to games that would have quite the influence on the style of the 2010 film years later. Also worth noting, you can put Olivia Wilde in anything and immediately make it better because of it. Just saying. And at number 7 is Hitman. Based off the Rockstar game of the same name, this 2007 film stars Timothy Olyphant as Agent 47, and despite not being a critical masterpiece, it was actually a financial success, earning $99 million against its $24 million budget. Not too shabby. Roger Ebert gave the film 3 out of 4 stars, commenting, I quote, "Hitman stands right on the threshold between video games and art. On the wrong side of the threshold, but still, give it credit." And at number 6 is Mortal Kombat. This 1995 loosely based adaptation is one of the films on this list that did pretty well for itself, box office wise. Earning an estimated $122 million worldwide, it was number 1 at the box office. For a while, actually. And to date is the 5th highest grossing video game adaptation released in the US as of September 2016. Critics commented on how it was notably free of blood and gore, and that the film, despite having a vague narrative, was so action-packed that it almost perfectly suited the game. And if you do pay attention to its attempt at a plot, well, you can kinda see why it's a cult classic these days. And at number 5 is Warcraft. One of the more recent films on our list, this film was actually announced back in 2006, but didn't get into production until much later, with its release date being June 10th of 2016. In terms of its narrative, it follows the first encounters of humans and orcs. And while some really enjoyed the film, many felt it fell victim to its heavy use of CGI. Others felt that the CGI orcs were the best part of the movie, with the opinion that they actually had depth compared to their human counterparts, which I can kinda see. Up next, number 4 is Doom. So the original Doom game didn't really have a plot, or at least a complex narrative rather. So one can see how this 2005 film would be more inclined to base itself off of Doom 3 rather than its 1993 predecessor. Starring Carl Urban and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, Doom was a box office bomb, grossing only $56 million worldwide, $4 million short of its $60 million budget. Set in the year 2046, the film follows Marines who answer a distress call from a research facility on Mars. While the film wasn't Oscar material, it does have one fantastic scene that's an homage to the game, filmed in a first-person perspective to represent the FPS point of view. Up next, number 3 is Silent Hill. Based off of the Silent Hill game series, this 2006 film starred Radha Mitchell and Sean Bean. It took 5 years for filmmakers to get the rights from Konami, with director Christoph Gaines even sending a video to the developer, articulating his adoration of the video game and his desire to do the franchise justice on the big screen. Despite getting a lot of heat for subpar dialogue, a messy plot, and a hefty runtime, the film did score some points for its chilly cinematography, its production design, and its overall style, and pulled in almost $100 million worldwide. The film follows a woman who brings her adopted daughter to the town of Silent Hill, where she gets into a car accident upon arriving. Her daughter goes missing, and as she tries to discover where she is, she uncovers not only her daughter's past connection to the town, but also a local cult. Up next, number 2 is Lara Croft Tomb Raider. With star power like Angelina Jolie, it's easy to see why these 2001 and 2003 films were big blockbuster hits. Jolie fit into the fantasy Lara Croft oh so easily, and while the franchise, from the latest games and the new upcoming film set for 2018, are now steering the character into a more relatable coming-of-age narrative and less of a tentacular one, these two adaptations did do a good job of encompassing certain elements of the game that were a crucial part to Lara Croft's overall history. And finally, in at number 1 is the Resident Evil film franchise. Now, I know it may seem a bit unfair to bulk all of the Resident Evil films into number 1, but this isn't a list of the top 10 Resident Evil movies now, is it? Arguably the most successful game to cinema transition, the franchise boasts a total of 6 films with talk of a reboot currently in development. While it's a popular opinion that the last 3 films were well, questionable in quality. Many fans felt that as far as cinematic adaptations go, the films did a very good job at translating the story and terror that makes Resident Evil games so lovable and compelling. And at number 10 is Edge of Tomorrow. Let's start off this list with some broad strokes. Many people think that Edge of Tomorrow, aka Live, Die, Repeat, is a film that generally is an adaptation of video games as a whole. It's a 2014 sci-fi action film starring Tom Cruise and Emily Blunt. But what you guys may not have known is that it's inspired by the Japanese novel All You Need Is Kill by Hiroshi Sakurazaka. He was inspired by an online account written by a video game player who was discussing how restarting the game after the playable character's death allowed for trial and error improvement, inspiring Sakurazaka to write a story in which the hero was being played over and over and over. Up next, number 9 is Inglourious Basterds. Many a fan have pointed out the similarities between Bionic Commando and Tarantino's Inglourious Basterds. While there is no confirmation as to whether or not the film was inspired by the NES 1988 classic, it still has some pretty loosely similar plots. Both feature infiltration behind enemy lines and both result in Hitler's assassination. Up next, number 8 is Clash of the Titans and God of War. While it's quite obvious that the God of War series is a culmination of several Greek mythological media influences, including the original Clash of the Titans 1981 film, this 2010 remake has many visual elements that people felt echoed the game franchise. And funny enough, the game version of Clash of the Titans remake is pretty much a copycat of God of War. All in the cinematography, friends. Up next, number 7 is Pirates of the Caribbean and the Monkey Island series. This one is sometimes seen as more of a rip-off rather than based on or inspired by. Actually, it is just a straight up rip-off. Okay, so yes, Pirates of the Caribbean is technically based off of the Disney ride. Sure, because that totally has a narrative, right? Well, back in 1990, The Secret of Monkey Island came out, and its protagonist Guybrush shares many similarities with Orlando Bloom's Will Turner, down to their outfits. The female lead in Monkey Island is captured by an undead pirate, and guess who else is captured by an undead pirate? Elizabeth Swann. There's a lot of other similarities in the franchise that echoed the game that came before it. Voodoo priestess who lives in a swamp, a town made of wrecked pirate ships, and so on. But this ripoff may be due to writer Ted Elliott, who was credited for the Monkey Island film adaptation that was cancelled in 2000. Ted went on to write for Pirates, and it's safe to suspect that perhaps Teddy reused parts of his old script. Up next, number 6 is the Pokemon anime. Alright, so this is cheating a tad despite the fact that there are a bunch of Pokemon movies that have come out of the woodwork over the past few decades. Many a fan got on board the Pokemon bandwagon after the anime television show blew up in 1997. The franchise started with Japan's Pokemon Red and Green games back in 1996, 21 years ago as of this recording. Pokemon is the second best-selling video game franchise to date, with only the Mario franchise surpassing it. Up next, number 5 is Snowpiercer and BioShock. Here we have another case of a film that shares a lot of parallels with a game, despite it not being official that the two have any sort of relation, or that the film was inspired by such. Snowpiercer tells the story of a dystopian society that lives entirely on a train. Earth was ravaged by a freak natural disaster that has rendered it icy and uninhabitable, and there's a massive class divide on the train / once luxury liner that humans now call home. So how is it similar to BioShock? Well, both are societies cut off from the world outside, both dystopian, both feature social class divides, and the cherry on top, Wilford, who runs the train, is very similar to Andrew Ryan, the man who built Rapture. Both are egotistical megalomaniacs who built their societies on messed up political ideologies. Up next, at number 4 is In the Name of the King and the Dungeon Siege video games. Director Uwe Boll is known for making video game inspired films and adaptations. Whether or not you think they're any good is another debate in itself, but apparently critics didn't think that this 2007 film was all that great. The film stars Jason Statham, John Rhys Davies, and Ron Perlman, and was inspired by the Dungeon Siege series. The game, on the other hand, was critically acclaimed, mainly for its graphics and fun, accessible gameplay, despite a mediocre plot. So perhaps the lesson here is to not make a film about a game that's got a weak story to begin with. Up next, number 3 is Hostel Part 2 and Chiller. Chiller was a gun arcade game released back in 1986 in which you play as a torturer who mutilates and murders NPCs in different private dungeons. So I imagine you can see the comparisons to Hostel, and specifically Hostel Part 2, which takes place in a private dungeon. The game itself got a lot of heat, not just for its excessive use of violence and gore, but also its ideologies. Rather than fighting enemies who are capable of defending themselves, you were tormenting the innocent, strictly for entertainment. And at number 2 we have Tron. We mentioned Tron Legacy on our top 10 movies based on video games list, so naturally we want to talk about the 1982 film that was inspired by one of video game history's trailblazers, Pong. Creator Steven Lisberger initially began development on Tron back in 1976, completely fascinated with the game Pong, and wanted to make a film inspired by video games in general. He said, I quote, "I realized that there were these techniques that were very suitable for bringing video games and computer visuals to the screen, and and thus the franchise was born. And finally, in our number 1 spot is Wreck-It Ralph. Based on the 1981 Donkey Kong arcade classic, the film follows an arcade game villain named Ralph, who decides to rebel against his antagonizing role and become a hero himself. Ralph notably shares a lot of qualities to Donkey Kong, who in the real-life game is the villain to protagonist Jumpman, Jumpman later becoming Mario. The film started its development back in the late 1980s with Disney, then being under the working title High Score. The film is chock full of video game references too, especially retro ones, including Pac-Man, Sonic the Hedgehog, Mega Man, and Super Mario Bros.
Number 10. Warcraft. To start us off, we have Warcraft, based on the popular MMORPG World of Warcraft. And the funny thing is, this isn't even one of the worst movies out there based on a video game. In fact, although I wanted to acknowledge how big the hype was and how mediocre the film seemed in comparison, this film actually wasn't that bad. In my opinion. Maybe I'm the only one that likes Warcraft, especially for being based on WoW. I personally just wanted to see those sweet mounts, so I was pretty easily appeased with this one. But the story here was actually pretty decent and did a good job of setting up the world, I thought. Still, the film being a kind of expositional film focused on setting up the world meant that it was a little slow for some, and despite having a massive budget, the film still unfortunately struggled to look as good as I think fans were kind of expecting. The reality is there was just a lot to do with this movie in terms of effects and costumes and, well, everything. And locations too. And yet I feel like so much of it was like green screen locations. I don't know. Number 9. Rampage. I mean, you have to give them props for trying this. Turning Rampage into a film is quite a feat. A game where you play as a monster and just try to destroy buildings. And studios wondered, but what's the story there? Who really are these monsters? Who are the people behind them? The Rampage film came out in 2018, and while it didn't escape the video game curse, it didn't actually do terribly, being about on par with Warner Brothers' attempt to reboot the famous video game franchise turned film series Tomb Raider, released the same year. Still, it's really hard to make a game about a group of monsters destroying buildings and turn it into something successful. I mean, Godzilla is an established film franchise about just that, and even those films have their problems and struggle from time to time. Or, I mean, most of the time, in my experience. Number 8. Max Payne. I gotta say, 20th Century Fox has a lot of explaining to do when it comes to video game movies. They seem to be responsible for a lot of these lackluster video game franchise films. Although, to be fair, they've also made a lot of good films besides, but jeez. Can we also just remember that the 2008 Max Payne film also featured Mark Wahlberg and Mila Kunis, and even still was unable to succeed? Wow. Also, Max Payne with its film noir pastiche is a game that you would think would lend really, really well to a film, but apparently not. What the movie seemed to lack was a lot of what made the game so iconic. The depth of story and character that we saw in the games appeared to be almost completely lost in the film version somehow, with a lot of the big video game moments just not really translating as well to film or being poorly adapted by the filmmakers. Not hating on Mark Wahlberg though, he tried, he definitely tried. Number 7. Pixels. This is a film that combined all your favorite arcade games from the 80s and repurposed them as a tool for an alien invasion. Of course, a fair one at least, because these aliens apparently believe in giving those they go up against a fair shot at victory to prove themselves. While the movie is good for a few laughs, it doesn't really offer any depth when it comes to exploring the world of 80s arcade games and is neither great nor bad. It's just kind of forgettable and a bit meh. And before we move on to this next point, just a quick reminder, if you love video game movies or maybe love to hate them a little bit sometimes, feel free to show that love by giving this video a thumbs up. It really does help us out here at the channel. Thank you. Number 6. Doom. Just look at stills from this movie and you will get a sense for how bad it is. When you hear that Doom is a film featuring the badass action star that is Dwayne Johnson, you might think, how could this possibly be bad? Also, Carl Urban was in this movie too, so I'm not gonna let him off the hook either. Well, it all kind of boils down to bad jokes that kind of fall flat, combined with this film being less about the demon killing action and more about fights between the team for who should really be in charge. Misdirected machismo that ended up making the film a massive flop. If only that machismo had gone where it was needed, then it would be really good, I think. Or at least it would be better than it was. Number 5. Mortal Kombat Annihilation. I will give the first 90s Mortal Kombat a pass because it has kind of become for many camp-filled sort of cult classic, but I cannot possibly give you its follow-up, Mortal Kombat Annihilation, the sequel. This film just went way too far without enough self-awareness. Within the first few seconds, I think you'll feel what I'm feeling when it comes to Annihilation. Those 90s effects though, like what is happening? While the plot for the first film seemed to acknowledge the ridiculousness of sort of the whole premise of the story, this follow-up doesn't really do any of that, and it actually takes itself more often than not far too seriously. And I understand that they were trying to do like the actual sequel story, which is good, but yeah, it did not translate. I understand they were also trying to make this thing feel just like a way more epic probably in comparison to the first movie, but no, just no. Number 4, Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. As much as I like Jake Gyllenhaal as an actor, I feel like the choice to cast him in the Prince of Persia movie as the main character, Dastan, the Prince of Persia, was maybe not the best choice, especially as he also seemed to struggle with his British accent throughout the whole thing. And if you're like, wait, if they're in Persia, why do they have British accents? Well, if you play the Prince of Persia game, you'll get it. Prince of Persia: Sands of Time, they all kind of have British accents. Don't ask me, it's just how it is. Just thought I needed to mention that because I saw so many articles where people were outraged about it, and I was like, I think that's from the video games, actually. And hey, you know, I will admit Gyllenhaal is pretty on the mark when it comes to sort of channeling Dastan's energy. Critically speaking, this movie wasn't as poorly received as some of the others that are on this list, but this casting choice just, I mean, really threw me for a loop. And while the film didn't garner some of the horrendous reviews that other video game movies have, it still wasn't well received either. Currently, it sits at like 50% on Rotten Tomatoes, which means, like most video game movies that many of us have forgotten, Prince of Persia is just kinda okay. Especially considering you have Disney behind this movie, I feel like they could have done a lot better than just like okay. Number 3, Assassin's Creed. What's really disappointing when it comes to the Assassin's Creed movie is that the trailer actually made it look like it was gonna be pretty badass. Like, this is a movie that got people excited, and yet. The problem with Assassin's Creed, the movie, was that it didn't give Assassin's Creed fans enough of what they wanted, and definitely not enough assassinations. They had the Animus, and we did get to go back in time and relive the assassin ancestor life with our lead, Michael Fassbender, who doesn't actually play Desmond Miles, the main character of the first game, but instead plays a non-game character, Cal Lynch, which I guess is fine, but like, where was Miles? What's happening here? Number 2, Need for Speed. Did you even know that this movie existed? Because I did not until this list. And yet, Need for Speed came out in 2014. I know! Need for Speed has a kind of loose plot, and honestly, this could be probably any racing movie, but I guess they decided if they secured the Need for Speed name and used it, it would maybe help them at the box office. To be fair, the movie does feature some pretty cool car stunts and racing scenes that evoke that kind of action-packed Need for Speed thrill. And there's racing, so there's that. But what we get in Cars, we kind of lack in a logical plot. The movie centers around Toby, who is wrongfully convicted of manslaughter in the death of his friend. Unable to prove his innocence, he instead focuses on getting revenge against the man who actually put him in jail and cost his friend his life. How does he do this? By racing! Wait, what? Because he's got the need for speed? The really weird thing is that winning the race actually miraculously does fix everything in this movie, and it's also like an illegal race. Like, they are racing illegally. So Toby also still has to go back to jail, but he basically gets cleared of the manslaughter charges that were on him before, and they find out that the other guy did it, and it's really weird. It's a really weird movie. Also, someone steals like a military helicopter. What is even happening in Need for Speed? Poor Aaron Paul, who's in that movie too. He's such a good actor, and I'm just like, what is this movie? I hope he got paid well. Number 1, Super Mario Brothers. Super Mario Brothers is a movie that is just so awful, it's almost good. Almost. Not quite. For most people, it still manages to miss that mark when it comes to being a cult classic, so bad that it becomes good. This is a movie based off of a video game franchise for children that completely fails to try and make a story or characters that are child-friendly. All the creatures from the game turn into horrific, monster-like versions of themselves that will haunt your nightmares. Yet somehow, despite the fact that Super Mario Bros. Premise involves a loopy story revolving around the question, what if the meteor that killed the dinosaurs could take you to another dimension? It's still still managed to somehow attract talented actors like John Leguizamo, what is he doing in this movie, and convince him to run around in overalls while playing Luigi. But also John Leguizamo's Luigi is pretty great. Seriously, whoever the casting director was, they must be some kind of miracle worker to have gotten some of these actors in the room. Like, I don't know how they convinced them to even read for this project. It's so, like, off the wall weird.
Starting us off at number 10, Uncharted. Recently, a fan-made Uncharted film hit the interwebs and became a viral hit. Now we say fan lightly, because the person who made it and played Nathan Drake was none other than Nathan Fillion. He's been a dream casting choice for many fans of Uncharted for a long time now, so it was pretty darn neat to see that come alive. Now, while there has been talk for over a decade about an official Uncharted film, it was announced last year that director Shawn Levy was attached to the project, and Tom Holland is reportedly being attached to play Drake. But things still seem like they're moving a little bit slow, despite Levy's promise recently that the script is in good form and scheduling and additional casting are the next steps. Who knows? Maybe we'll see it come out in the next few years. Up next, number 9, Outlast. Both Outlast and Outlast 2 would make horrifically scary movies, specifically the second, which has a significantly larger amount of character development than the first. Regardless of which title you prefer more though, both Outlast games exist in settings that are the stuff of nightmare fuel, and have enough twists and turns to keep moviegoers preoccupied with what unpredictable horror may show up next. Hey, it'd even make a good candidate for a POV movie, although those tend to not have the best response from critics either. Up next, number 8, Pokemon. Okay, sure, there's a bunch of Pokemon animated films that have been produced over the years, often with a lot of success. But for over a decade now, fans of the series have always wanted to see, or dreaded the idea of, a live-action feature film. And it makes sense why there are so many opposing opinions on this. It could be utterly disastrous, CG could go wrong in so many ways, and it would be really difficult to avoid the campier cringe territory, given the lighthearted nature that the Pokemon series has always boasted. But I think the most important question is how they would approach making the Pokemon. Go for animated versions, or kind of horrific monster-looking versions? That could also be really cool. Who knows? A lot of potential there. Alright, next up at number 7, The Legend of Zelda. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here with this suggestion too, especially since Link is historically a protagonist with not much personality. Rather, he's a protagonist that players can easily project themselves onto, and it's clearly effective. The franchise is one of Nintendo's most beloved across the globe, and its titles continue to impress with how rich their worlds are. There's also a few games that would make fantastic candidates for film, particularly Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, although the latter would be one hell of a heavy film to watch, but could be really well done. And at number 6, God of War. God of War's most recent installment shook up the series, in a very positive way. Now focusing more on Kratos' development as a character and his relationship with new character, his young son Atreus, the game explored new territory that the God of War franchise has never ventured into before. Many critics feel like it's the best title of 2018 to date. That only further fuels the fire as to why a God of War series or film should be made. It's no longer just about hacking and slashing and getting revenge. It's about so much more. And if that isn't convincing enough, the world of God of War has always been entertaining and immersive, rich in the Greek mythology it was based off of, and now the Norse mythology that it's expanded into, meaning there's a whole lot to work with. And at number 5, The Last of Us. The Last of Us deserves a spot on this list, but at the same time, it really doesn't. The storytelling in Naughty Dog's Titanic-size hit is already so beautifully done that it would almost feel criminal trying to adapt Joel and Ellie's story to the big or small screen without losing something. The Last of Us is very much an example of video games as a form of artistic storytelling. That being said, if done correctly, a cinematic adaptation could be something equally as brilliant. The game is already filled with fantastic characters, a whole lot of conflict, and moments that are basically emotional roller coaster rides. The giraffes. A talented filmmaker could bring it to life with ease, but a studio looking to make some serious bank off of it could possibly do more damage than it's worth. And at number 4, The Witcher. That would be brilliant, right? Well, it's already happening thanks to Netflix. While not much information has been released about The Witcher cinematic adaptation yet, we do know a handful of things. It was initially supposed to be a feature film, but because of how robust the stories are, the producers behind it felt that it would better fit as a TV series. We know the synopsis is, the Witcher, Geralt, a mutated monster hunter, struggles to find his place in a world where people often prove more wicked than beasts. We know that Lauren S. Hissrich, who has written for Daredevil, The Defenders, and The West Wing, is writing the pilot, and will be acting as the showrunner. She also recently tweeted this out. I think the only two things I've ever confirmed are, 1. Geralt will be a man, 2. The show won't be watered down. Now there's also a Witcher film that currently exists, made back in 2001 in Poland called The Hexer, but it's fairly unknown and looks like it could potentially be pretty cringe. And at number 3, LA Noire. Rockstar's LA Noire was pretty groundbreaking when it first came out. Looking back at it now, you can easily see its flaws, but it still gets a big thumbs up for effort. It's a game that if it were to be released nowadays, would be absolutely mind-blowing with what developers are capable of doing thanks to current technology. That being said, one of the reasons why LA Noire is such a beloved game is because of how fascinating the story is, and the way that it integrated real-life crimes into its narrative. You play as Cole Phelps, a decorated veteran after World War II, who returns to the US and becomes a patrol officer in the LAPD. He eventually is promoted to a detective, and you work your way through the various crime units in the LAPD until Cole begins to unravel a scandal, and thus is manipulated into being demoted and becoming a bit of a disgraced detective. The plot only thickens from there, with the story having the potential to contain enough subtleties that would read much better in a live-action adaptation. And at number 2, Mass Effect. Mass Effect has all of the makings of a science fiction trilogy epic. The first 3 games follow the story of a soldier named Commander Shepard, who you can choose to play as either male or female. Shep's mission is to save the galaxy from a race called the Reapers, who are powerful mechanical beings who tens of thousands of years earlier exterminated all sentient life in the galaxy as part of their reoccurring cycle of genocide. So yeah, definitely has the right stuff there. While some people believe that it would work well as a trilogy of 3 feature films, other people see it better as a series. Plus, while Mass Effect Andromeda may have gotten some mixed reviews, it does open up a whole lot of potential for story continuation within that same universe. Spin-offs! And finally, in at number 1, Kentucky Route Zero. Kentucky Route Zero is the stuff of Oscar bait. You play as a truck driver named Conway in this stunning point-and-click game. He's on his last delivery before the shop he works for is officially out of business. The game has been described as a Southern Gothic ghost story with some David Lynch magical realism. Praised for its writing, diverse cast of characters, and mysterious tone, the game has 5 acts in which you make your way down a secret highway called the Zero, in the caves beneath Kentucky. It all starts with Conway asking for directions at a place called Equus Oils, and unravels from there. Critics have called it powerfully evocative and a beautiful subversion of the point-and-click game, and quite frankly, the story, well, it'll make a really good movie or TV show.